They stood within arm's reach of history's most infamous dictator for 12 years. They knew his private routines, his moods, his habits. They guarded the Reich Chancellery corridors, scanned crowds for threats, tasted his food for poison. Yet when Adolf Hitler pulled the trigger on April 30th, 1945, these men who had pledged absolute loyalty found themselves facing a world that no longer had use for their particular skills. The SS-Begleitkommando, the Reichssicherheitsdienst, the Führerbegleitkommando, elite bodyguard units designed to protect one man, suddenly had no purpose. Some would spend the next decade in Soviet labor camps. Others would vanish into American custody. A few would die in the bunker's final hours. But all of them faced the same question. What happens to guards when their Führer is dead? Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The story begins not in the bunker's last desperate days, but in Munich, 1923. After Hitler's failed beer hall putsch, the Nazi Party recognized that its leader needed protection. The Stoßtrupp Hitler was formed, 8 men selected from war veterans and street brawlers. Their job was simple: keep Hitler alive in a city where political assassinations were common currency. These weren't ceremonial guards. They carried weapons. They fought. In the chaos of Weimar Germany, where communist and nationalist militias clashed in the streets, Hitler's bodyguards were combat troops. By 1933, when Hitler seized power, the amateur protection squad had transformed into something more organized. Johann Rottenhuber, a Munich police officer who had served in the 16th Bavarian Infantry during World War I, was appointed to lead the Führerschutzkommando. Rottenhuber's background was law enforcement, not party politics. He understood security protocols, threat assessment, perimeter control. Under his command, the protection unit became professional. They studied routes before motorcades. They vetted every person entering Hitler's presence. They established security zones around the Reich Chancellery, Berchtesgaden, and wherever the Führer traveled. The Führerschutzkommando was renamed Reichssicherheitsdienst in August 1935. This wasn't just bureaucratic reorganization. Heinrich Himmler gained administrative control, folding the unit into the SS structure. The RSD now wore SS uniforms with the SD diamond insignia on their left sleeves, but they answered primarily to Hitler, not Himmler. This created dual loyalty, a tension that would define their entire existence. They were SS men, but their oath was personal, to protect one individual, not the party apparatus. Alongside the RSD operated another unit, the SS-Begleitkommando des Führers, which evolved into the Führerbegleitkommando by 1939. The FBK was Hitler's immediate close protection detail. Bruno Gesche commanded this unit for years. These men stayed within sight of Hitler at all times. When Hitler ate, they stood behind his chair. When he walked through gardens at Berchtesgaden, they followed 10 paces back. They were the only armed personnel Hitler allowed near him. The distinction between RSD and FBK was tactical. The RSD secured locations, buildings, routes, perimeters. The FBK secured Hitler's person. During public events, both units deployed together under Rottenhuber's overall command, but they maintained separate chains of command, separate vehicles, separate operational protocols. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the RSD had grown to 200 men. These were not random SS recruits. They were selected from criminal police officers, men trained in surveillance and threat detection. They established security at Hitler's field headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Wehrwolf in Ukraine, the Berghof in Bavaria. Each location required advanced surveys, security sweeps, and constant vigilance. In January 1942, before Hitler's planned arrival at the Wehrwolf bunker, Rottenhuber ordered the surrounding area cleared of Jews. On January 10th, RSD units participated in the mass shooting of 227 Jews at Strychovka, the actual construction site of Hitler's headquarters. The bodyguards were not merely passive protectors. They carried out killings to sanitize security zones. The bodyguards witnessed history from inside the bubble. They saw Hitler's rage after military defeats. They heard him dictate orders that sent armies to destruction. They watched his health deteriorate, the trembling left hand, the stooped posture, the gray complexion. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet since 1935, dressed him each morning. Rokas Misch, a telephonist and bodyguard, operated the bunker's communication switchboard. Otto Günsche, Hitler's SS adjutant, stood outside his door. Erich Kempke served as his personal chauffeur, driving the armored Mercedes through streets lined with crowds or ruins depending on the year. These men lived in proximity that bred both loyalty and disillusionment. They were true believers who had pledged their lives to Hitler's protection. But as the Reich collapsed around them, some began to understand that their purpose was tethered to a sinking ship. By January 1945, the security apparatus had contracted to its final defensive position, the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery garden in Berlin. Rattenhuber moved underground with Hitler. The RSD maintained perimeter security even as Soviet artillery shattered the streets above. Franz Schadle commanded the FBK in these final months. The bodyguards understood they were trapped. No amount of training could stop the Red Army divisions encircling the city. Their role had become existential, not to prevent assassination, but to delay the inevitable. On April 28th, Heinrich Himmler's secret surrender negotiations to the Western Allies were discovered. Hitler, feeling betrayed by the man who commanded the entire SS, ordered a tribunal to court-martial Himmler's liaison officer, Hermann Fegelein, who was also Eva Braun's brother-in-law. Rattenhuber sat on that tribunal alongside Generals Wilhelm Mohnke, Hans Krebs, and Wilhelm Burgdorf. Fegelein arrived drunk, crying, vomiting, unable to stand. He urinated on the floor during questioning. The tribunal judged him unfit to stand trial. Mohnke closed the proceedings and turned Fegelein over to Rattenhuber's RSD security squad, who executed him in the Chancellery garden. On the evening of April 29th, Hitler summoned Rattenhuber to his private room. It was Rattenhuber's birthday the next day, but Hitler knew he would not be alive to offer congratulations. "You have served me faithfully for many years," Hitler told him. "Tomorrow is your birthday, and I want to congratulate you and thank you for your faithful service, because I shall not be able to do so tomorrow. I have taken the decision. I must leave this world." Rattenhuber tried to argue, suggesting Hitler could still escape Berlin, that his survival was essential for Germany. Hitler's response was final. "What for? Everything is ruined, and to flee means falling into the hands of the Russians." The next afternoon, April 30th, Hitler killed himself in his private study. Rattenhuber was not in the room when the shot was fired. He did not see Hitler's body until it was already wrapped in gray blankets. Heinz Linge and Otto Günsche carried the body up the bunker stairs. Rattenhuber, along with Peter Hügel and Ewald Lindlof, followed them into the Chancellery garden. They watched as gasoline was poured over Hitler's remains and Eva Braun's corpse. They watched the flames consume what was left of the man they had spent years protecting. There was no ceremony. Soviet shells were exploding 200 meters away. The bodyguard stood at attention briefly, then returned to the bunker. The protection mission ended. What replaced it was survival. On May 1st, the remaining bunker occupants attempted to break out through Soviet lines. Rattenhuber led one of 10 groups escaping the Chancellery complex. They moved through subway tunnels and bombed-out streets, trying to reach the Spree River and cross into western sectors. Most groups were captured within hours. Rattenhuber was taken prisoner on May 2nd by Red Army troops. Franz Schadle, commander of the FBK, never made it out of the bunker district. He committed suicide on May 2nd rather than face capture. Otto Günsche and Heinz Linge were captured together. The Soviets had specific interest in these two men. They had been closest to Hitler in his final moments. They knew details about his death that Stalin needed to confirm or disprove. The Soviet dictator harbored paranoid suspicions that Hitler had faked his death and escaped. Gunsche and Linge were transported to Moscow. For years they were interrogated, sometimes held in solitary confinement. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, demanded precise accounts of Hitler's suicide. They wanted to know who saw the body, who moved it, who burned it, where the ashes were disposed. Gunsche and Linge provided testimony, but Stalin never fully believed them. In February 1952, both men were sentenced by a Soviet military tribunal to 25 years hard labor. The charges were standard for high-ranking SS officers: war crimes, service to the Nazi regime, participation in criminal organizations. The sentences were not about specific acts they committed. They were punished for their proximity to Hitler, for being the last witnesses, for serving the regime until its final breath. They were sent to labor camps in Siberia and East Germany. For years they worked in mines, forests, construction projects. They endured cold, hunger, disease, and the monotonous brutality of Soviet prison camps. Rokas Misch, the telephonist who had operated the bunker switchboard, was also captured on May 2nd while trying to escape through Berlin's ruined streets. He was 27 years old. The Soviets imprisoned him for 9 years. Unlike Gunsche and Linge, Misch had not been part of Hitler's inner decision-making circle. He was support staff, not leadership. But he had been present in the bunker. He had witnessed the final days. That was enough. He spent nearly a decade in Soviet captivity, returning to Germany in 1954. He never spoke publicly about his experiences until decades later, when historians sought his testimony. By then he was an old man, one of the last living witnesses to Hitler's death. Johann Rattenhuber, the RSD chief who had commanded Hitler's security apparatus for 12 years, gave a detailed account of Hitler's final days to Soviet interrogators on May 20, 1945. The Soviets kept his testimony classified for over 50 years. In August 1951, 6 years after the war ended, he was formally charged. From the early days of the Nazi dictatorship in 1933 and until the defeat of the latter in 1945, being an SS Gruppenführer, police lieutenant general, and the chief of the Reich Security Service, he ensured the personal security of Hitler and other Reich leaders. The charges also referenced his involvement in the January 1942 massacre at Strychovka, where his RSD units murdered 227 Jews to secure Hitler's Wehrwolf headquarters. On February 15, 1952, he was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. Rattenhuber spent years in Soviet prisons. In September 1955, following West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's negotiations in Moscow, the Soviet Union agreed to release thousands of German prisoners still held 10 years after the war. Rattenhuber was released on October 10, 1955, and handed over to East German authorities, who allowed him to travel to West Germany in 1956. He settled in Munich, the city where his career had begun, under the Weimar Republic police force. He died there in June 1957, less than 2 years after his release. He was 60 years old. His health had been destroyed by a decade in Soviet captivity. Otto, Gunsche, and Heinz Linge were released in 1955 and 1956, respectively, part of the same diplomatic agreement that freed Rattenhuber. They had spent over 10 years in Soviet prisons. When they returned to Germany, they found a country transformed. The Federal Republic had been established. The economic miracle was underway. Denazification tribunals had processed hundreds of thousands of former Nazis, categorizing them as major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, or exonerated persons. Most low-ranking SS members had been released by the early 1950s. Some had been fined. Some lost their pensions. But by the mid-1950s, West Germany was reintegrating former soldiers and party members into society. The Cold War demanded focus on the Soviet threat, not endless prosecution of the past. Günsche and Linge lived quietly. Günsche settled in Lohmar, North Rhine-Westphalia. He rarely spoke about his service. In the 1970s, he was interviewed by historians compiling accounts of Hitler's final days. He provided factual testimony, but avoided moral reflection. He died in October 2003 at the age of 86, having outlived the regime he served by 58 years. Linge settled in Hamburg. He published his memoirs in 1980, titled With Hitler to the End. The book was clinical, detailing daily routines, Hitler's habits, the atmosphere in the bunker. Linge died in March 1980, 3 months before his memoir was published. Not all bodyguards fell into Soviet hands. Bruno Gesche, who had commanded the FBK for years, was not in Berlin during the final collapse. Hitler had dismissed him in 1944 after repeated incidents of public drunkenness. Gesche was reassigned to the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division and sent to Italy. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Gesche surrendered to American forces. He was held in American POW camps but faced no war crimes charges. He was released and returned to civilian life in West Germany, dying in 1980. His survival was unremarkable. He had been removed from Hitler's inner circle early enough that Allied investigators had little interest in him. Erich Kempka, Hitler's personal chauffeur since 1934, escaped the bunker with the breakout groups on May 1st. He was wounded during the escape attempt, but evaded immediate capture. On June 20, 1945, American troops arrested him at Berchtesgaden. Kempka was held in U.S. custody and interrogated about Hitler's death. He provided testimony confirming that he had helped pour gasoline over Hitler's body. He admitted to being an unreliable witness. He had been traumatized by the scene and his memory was fragmented. American authorities released him in October 1947. Kempka settled in West Germany and published his memoirs in 1951 under the title Ich habe Adolf Hitler verbrannt. I cremated Adolf Hitler. He worked in various jobs and lived quietly until his death in January 1975. The fate of Hitler's bodyguards reflected broader patterns of post-war justice. Those captured by the Soviets faced the harshest treatment, 10 to 25-year sentences in labor camps, years of interrogation, isolation, and forced labor. Those captured by Western allies were typically held for shorter periods, interrogated, then released without trial if they were not connected to specific war crimes. The disparity was stark. Soviet justice sought retribution and intelligence extraction. Western justice sought evidence for Nuremberg trials and then moved toward rebuilding Germany as a Cold War ally. In West Germany during the 1950s, denazification faded as a priority. The government needed technocrats, engineers, teachers, police officers. Many former Nazis were quietly reintegrated. There was no comprehensive purge of the civil service or judiciary. By the late 1950s, thousands of former SS members held government jobs. This caused controversy, but the political will to continue prosecutions weakened. Hitler's bodyguards, if they survived Soviet captivity, slipped back into German society. They were not celebrated. They were not prosecuted. They simply disappeared into the post-war anonymity that millions of former regime servants sought. Rochus Misch became a historical anomaly. He lived into the 21st century, dying in 2013 at age 96. By the 2000s, he was recognized as Hitler's last surviving bodyguard. Historians and journalists sought his testimony. He gave interviews reluctantly, describing the bunker's atmosphere, Hitler's final days, the chaos of the Soviet assault. Misch insisted he had known nothing about the Holocaust while serving in the bunker. He claimed he was simply a telephonist, a guard, not a decision-maker. Critics accused him of moral evasion. Defenders noted he had been 27 years old in 1945. a soldier following orders in a system that punished disobedience with death. Misch's story embodied the moral complexity of proximity to evil. He had been there, but what had he truly known, and what could he have done? The legacy of Hitler's bodyguards is not heroism or tragedy. It is obsolescence. These were men trained for one purpose: to keep Hitler alive. They succeeded for 12 years, longer than most analysts predicted the Nazi regime would survive. But when Hitler died, their expertise became worthless. The skills that made them valuable, tactical awareness, threat assessment, absolute loyalty, had no application in a world without a Führer. They could not transfer their experience to new employers. They could not leverage their service into post-war careers. They were relics of a collapsed state, men whose entire professional identity vanished in a bunker on April 30th, 1945. The Soviet sentences imposed on Rattenhuber, Gunsche, and Linge were not merely punishment. They were a form of historical accounting. Stalin wanted confirmation that Hitler was dead, not in hiding. The bodyguards' testimony provided that confirmation, but Stalin demanded they suffer for their role in preserving Hitler's life for so long. They had been too effective. If they had failed in 1939 or 1941 or 1943, perhaps millions of lives would have been saved. This reasoning, however emotionally satisfying, ignores the structural nature of the Nazi regime. If one bodyguard had faltered, another would have replaced him. The machine did not depend on individuals. It consumed them. By the 1960s, most of Hitler's bodyguards were dead or living under assumed identities. Those who survived Soviet captivity aged prematurely. Malnutrition, forced labor, and psychological trauma shortened their lives. Those who avoided Soviet capture lived longer but carried the stigma of their service. Some changed their names, some moved to rural areas, a few emigrated to South America or other countries where German communities provided anonymity. The vast majority never spoke publicly about their experiences. Their silence was self-preservation. Admitting to having served in Hitler's immediate entourage invited investigation, ostracism, and potential prosecution even decades after the war. The historical irony is this: Hitler's bodyguards succeeded at their mission until the very end, yet their success meant nothing. They kept him alive through assassination attempts, through the July 20, 1944 bomb plot, through the collapsing front lines. But Hitler's survival only prolonged the war, extended the suffering, deepened the catastrophe. The bodyguard's professional competence contributed to one of history's greatest disasters. And when the disaster concluded, they were discarded. The regime they served denied them pensions, denied them recognition, denied them even a coherent narrative. The Nazis valorized soldiers who died in combat, but they had no use for bodyguards who outlived the man they protected. The final accounting is brutal. Franz Schädler, suicide, May 2, 1945. Johann Rattenhuber, Soviet prison, released 1955, died 1957. Otto Gunsche, Soviet prison, released 1956, died 2003. Heinz Linge, Soviet prison, released 1955, died 1980. Rochus Misch, Soviet prison, released 1954, died 2013. Bruno Gesche, American POW, released 1945, died 1980. Erich Kempka, American POW, released 1947, died 1975. The men who stood closest to Adolf Hitler spent the rest of their lives explaining, justifying, or hiding what they had witnessed. History remembers their names only because they were present when history's most infamous dictator pulled the trigger. They were not architects of the Holocaust. They were not military strategists. They were guards who did their job so well that they became accessories to atrocity simply by being in the room. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.